6 encounters with Jesus in the book of John. And our last lesson, we spent some time with Jesus' encounter with the desperate nobleman who was seeking for healing for his son. And in the end, his desperation, of course, is turned into adoration for the Savior, and his faith grows from one of a crisis faith to one of a contagious faith, where he has evangelistic zeal and he's going out converting his own household, and I would assume probably engaging with people in his community. My son that was at the brink of death is now alive. In another encounter that we're going to look at tonight, he turns into a healing encounter. It is another healing encounter. We learned several lessons, I think, from what we're going to be looking at tonight, as far as the power of miracles and the creation of faith in the heart of an unbeliever. And this is when Jesus meets the lame man who is lying near the pool of Bethesda, longing for healing and relationship. And that's the two of the things that we look at this man's life, and those are two of the things that we'll look at in a little more detail in just a moment. When we open up in John chapter 5, beginning in verse 1, it says, "After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem." Now, John does not actually identify which feast of the Jews this is. The last feast that we saw was in chapter 2. It was the Passover. He engages there, of course, with Nicodemus in chapter 3 during that feast. And then in the intervening time, from then until now, the after, as he says here, after this, we might be tempted to read that and think, okay, just shortly after his encounter with the nobleman, this happens. And it may be true. It may be a week later. It could be up to a year and a half later, though, based upon the timeline of the book of John. So anywhere in that era or that time frame, which goes to show us, again, that John is not as dedicated to a chronological approach of his gospel, in as much as he is dealing with these, I think these very personal encounters to display or convey to us as the reader a certain understanding of who Jesus is. John is very much about identifying who Jesus is. Of course, I think Matthew, Mark, and Luke are doing very much the same thing. But if you keep that ever in front, because the writing that he has given to us, he says, is to create faith. But in order to have faith in Christ, you must know Christ. You must know who he is, what he has done, the power, his identity, not just on the earth in a material sense, but his identity as in the spiritual sense, in his being God. And so it's quite an amazing feat when we start putting those things together. So after this, it says there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in the city, or in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda. And so we have this particular pool, and the word Bethesda. Not when we look at these particular words, things that are in the Hebrew, and it has the word Beth. They would normally actually pronounce that Bet, but we would say Beth. But this word means house. And so when you get Bethel, for example, one of the cities south of Jerusalem, Bethel means house of God. Okay, and you get Bethlehem. Bethlehem is the house of bread. And so here we get a house of, and then we have a little question here on this particular part of the word, because it can be, in the Hebrew, pronounced Bethesda, or it could be Bethesda. A lot of difference there, right? The second word is either Hesda, with an H at the beginning, or Esda, without the H. It's really the only difference. If it is Bethesda, and then it would be the house of outpouring. If it is Bethesda, then it would be the house of mercy. Both of those would be translated into the Greek. Now, mind you, translation sometimes is hard because when I was growing up and in high school, in Libya, the dictator's name was Gaddafi. Y'all remember that? Gaddafi. And maybe 5 or 6 years ago, he came back into the news again. Same guy, but they called him what? Gaddafi with a G. Okay? Same guy. Okay? We also were after the famed terrorist Osama bin Laden. But 10 years prior to 9/11, he came up on terrorist radars and everyone was looking for Usama bin Laden with a U. Okay? Did he change his name from Usama to Osama or Gaddafi to Gaddafi? No. What we're talking about is pronunciation from one language to another language. Okay? And when we put that into the mix, for example, David, King David in the Hebrew, was David as we would say David, but in the Greek there is no V. So they give it an approximate sound. What sound in our alphabet sounds like a V, but it's not a V? V, B. And so in the Greek New Testament, when it refers to David, it's David with a B instead of a V. Okay, so that's how they have to do it. And so sometimes letters and sounds, especially in guttural languages like Near Eastern languages are, some of the sounds we don't have the exact sound for. And so it's difficult to translate, especially proper names, from one language into another language. And so it's not hard to see how Bethesda, Bethesda, and Bethesda could be, misunderstood going into the Greek. And then we have the added layer of eventually coming into the English, and that's the other side of that coin. There is a textual variant here, though, because there are a lot of manuscripts that have Bethzatha or Bethzatha, and there's some question about whether or not that's is that the right reading or not. And there's also a lot of manuscripts that have the word Bethsaida, S-A-I-D-A, Bethsaida. Well, Bethsaida is another town. It's far away. You could see where Bethesda and Bethsaida could be confused. That's pretty well just, most people look at that and say that's just, it doesn't really fit to the context here. So it's probably either Bethesda or Bethzatha. And there's not a lot of difference in sound in the Hebrew. There is more in the English, but not so much in the Hebrew or in the Greek. But what's interesting is most scholars, of course, take Bethesda, and I think that's because of the naval hospital, and they believe, no, I don't think it was because of that, but it does seem to fit the context better, the idea of the house of outpouring or the house of mercy. I tend to think that it's supposed to be mercy because of the tradition that surrounds Bethesda. Now, I've actually this is one of the images that I took while I was in Israel, and I thought I'd throw a couple of images up here for you. This is the Pool of Bethesda, and notice in the text it says that it was called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. And so we look on the image here, and we see these colonnades right here. There's one. Here's remnants of another right here, and remnants of another here. You'll actually see in another picture some more remnants down here. You can see, maybe you can't see, I don't know how well, the steps are right here going up away from the colonnade, and they're actually on both sides right here, and you would go down into this area here, which was the pool. and it's very deep. At this point, so what you're looking at here is in a lot of these towns in Israel, you have the main streets, and then you have a subterranean street, streets down below. And so, like on the level where I am would be equal to this level here, but you can see there's passageways right here that would eventually come around and come down to these steps. And so there's actually about 3 levels of streets right here in this area. Some of them were built later than others, but many of them are contemporary with one another. Read. So if the steps are going down into the water here, you can see on these colonnades. Let me erase something here. You can see on this particular colonnade where the arches are going way down on some of them, but here there's like a wall that's coming out, and that's going to be similar in height to the top of the steps here, to the top of this wall. And it would have been around in here. So most likely the depth of the actual pool would have been around 3 to 5 feet. Not real deep, but it is very low in the ground. In fact, if we go to the next one, you can see I'm standing at the main street level, and here's another of the remnants. There's one of the remnants. There's the one that was in the picture. There's another that was in the picture, and then there's one that's a hole. And you get all 5 of the colonnades here in a row. Pretty sure that this is the Pool of Bethesda. This is located just north of the temple complex, most people come here, and this is the Pool of Bethesda. Right here, you can see down below. There's some railing right here. There's another level here. On this level, there's actually tombs that date back into about the 16th century to I think the 13th century AD, so well after the time of Jesus, but they're tombs just off the Pool of Bethesda here, which was an interesting sight. And you can see there is a well or something that was down here, and it's possible that was a natural spring during the days of the first century, which would have caused the stirring of the waters. There's no water in it currently, no. You can see the greenery that's all grown up here. Most likely, a lot of these pools were made by applying, putting stone down and a plaster down. And if you did the same thing with a backyard pool, you put down a foundation and then a concrete pool, and the pool got a crack in it. Wouldn't hold water anymore. And the same thing happens here. Of course, you're talking, thousands of years have passed since then, and the cracks were there. Yeah. So it is near the sheep gate, and most believe, there's not 100% certainty that this is it, but it seems like the right place. And what they would do at the sheep gate is where worshipers would bring their livestock. They would bring the animal in, and they would wash the animal and prepare it for sacrifice at the temple. And so this would have actually been the pool where they washed the livestock. And then, of course, in verse 4, you have the tradition of, an angel stirring the waters, and the first one in, would have been the one that was healed. And this man is certainly of the opinion that that's what's happening here. But in verse 3, he says, within these colonnade roofs, in these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. And so we're looking at this tradition of verse 4. Now, most modern translations, anything since probably about 1940s, do not contain verse 4. So if you're looking at an NIV or an ESV, the New American Standard Bible, I believe even the American Standard from 1901, do not have verse 4. So there's a question, where did verse 4 go, and why did they leave it out? Carolyn? Okay, it has the text in a marginal note. Right. So the basic explanation is for that, and I'll give you the 2-cent version here. When you deal with the textual variant, like the city name or the pool name, is it Bethesda or Bethesda? We have a certain number of manuscripts. In fact, for the New Testament, there's over 5,000 witnesses in the original language, Greek, for the New Testament. That's a lot. Consider, like your Iliad and Odyssey, which run about 10. We don't even have that many manuscripts for Shakespeare's works. We have 8 or 9 of most of his plays, copies of his plays. We don't have that, and there's a reason for that. He was a man writing a play. This is the Word of God, and it is going to be, I think, by the providence of God, copied multiple times over and over and over again. But it's copied by hand, right? We say manuscript, which comes from the Latin manus, meaning hand, and script, meaning writing, handwritten. These are handwritten. I'll never forget one of my classmates in preaching school challenged the teacher about Moses having a Xerox copier to make copies of the law. He didn't understand we're not talking about Xerox, we're talking about painstaking copying by hand. They made mistakes at times. Okay? John 5:4 does not show up in the manuscript evidence until about the 9th century. That verse does not show up, of course, in John. John's the oldest fragment of the New Testament we have is the book of John. It's called Papyri 52, and it comes from somewhere in the early 2nd century. But from the early 2nd century onward, until the 9th century, there is no verse 4 in John 5. Okay? So how did it get there? Most believe that they would use the margins, and this is absolutely true. We go back, and just nearly every manuscript that we have has marginal notes. Sometimes it's a word that explains or defines a word that's in the text. On this particular line out to the side, they'll write another, for example, you've got your text is running here, and maybe this word right here is difficult, and so over here in the margin they add that word. That's called a gloss, where we get the word glossary, and it's to help define this particular word. And someone who's using it to teach it, maybe they're using that copy as their teaching copy, and they have notes in the margin of their Bible. Maybe you've got notes in the margin of your Bible. I have a Bible downstairs that eventually will make it into my rotation that is actually a wide margin Bible. Why would anyone want a wide margin Bible? It's because I put a lot of notes in the side of my Bible. And so very, very similar thing is happening here. And so maybe that note is a definition of a word, and they would call that a gloss. Sometimes there's a larger note out here to the side that explains why these things are happening. Okay? For example, why are there a bunch of invalids at the pool of Bethesda? Well, someone came along and said the tradition was that there was an angel that stirred the waters, and when the first one into the waters at the stirring was healed. And so that somehow, as with many of them, sometimes that was not a note, but sometimes this might be an amendment, because maybe that line was left out and the scribe couldn't fit it in there, so he put it in the margin, hoping the next time someone copied from this manuscript, they would have put it in there. And someone thought, oh, well, that's supposed to be in the text, and it became verse 4. That's the best theory right now about how it got in there. Mark, did you have a question? No, I don't think that we have any manuscripts where verse 4 is a marginal note. Yes, we have manuscripts with explanatory notes. Yes, but not this particular one. So early on, before the 9th century, all copies of John don't have that verse, or the vast majority. I'd have to go back and look. I didn't do a lot of study, but best I recall, there are no pre-9th century that contain verse 4. So the deal is we say, okay, well, how do we trust? Which Bible to use? Should it have verse 4 or should it not have verse 4? The evidence suggests that it's not real, and there's a plausible explanation about how it got in there, and so we can trust. Now, here's the question. Was there really an angel stirring the pool and people getting healed? Something like that. Most people, and I tend to agree, the Jews didn't have houses of healing. The Romans did. They had places where people would go and they would pay a certain amount of money and they would get healing. The Jews did not have that. In fact, they considered that near blasphemous, to sell the power of God, as it were, or to base it upon this particular. By the way, this is the animal pool. Do you know who avoided the animal pool? Rich people and religious people. They stayed away from it. Whatever y'all do over there, that's fine. The only people that were here were the poor and the lame. That's who came to the animal pool, and so man, I just turned my notes off for some reason. See if I can find them again. So the pool was it was considered a dirty place, and you know what happens when most people stay away from something? There's a lore that is built up around that particular place. Look, these are animals that are going to be sacrificed, and so there's a connection to some religiosity there, and then the idea that there is a natural spring here, which likely is what that well was, would have stirred the waters, and the lore built up that if you get in first, you get healed. Now, who would be the first into the pool? Yeah, the one that got down the stairs the easiest. The least sick, the most healthiest. Exactly right. And then there's a term we use today called psychosomatic, right? Psychosomatic, from the Greek psych or psyche, which means mind, and soma, which is body. Mind and body. So that if you believe positively that if you are the first one in, you get to come out whole. Does that have something to do with it? And then look at Jesus later when he comes and he finds the man after he's told him to take up his bed and walk. Notice verse 14. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple, and he said to him, "See, you are well." Now, why would Jesus tell him you're well? Can you imagine someone who was almost well, healthy enough to get into the pool first, comes out in the exuberance of "I'm healed," and goes off running and skipping and prancing, only to a couple hours later feel bad again? Jesus comes to him later and he says, "See, you are truly well." It wasn't a momentary thing. So is it possible that's what was happening in verse 4 that brought that tradition around? I think that's a good explanation of it. It certainly seems to fit in the context. Read. I don't know. That would be a good question to look up. There were some in the Apocrypha, obviously. For example, during the Maccabean revolt, when there was not enough oil to burn the lights long enough, and yet it burned steadily for many days, and gives rise to the Festival of Lights, or in the Jewish tradition, Hanukkah, which would be a miracle after the prophetic age. Then, so there are definitely some references to them. Obviously, I don't think that there was a miracle at Hanukkah with the oil lasting through that age, but it's certainly something to look at and study. Yeah. Now, the people definitely believed in it. The first century Jews, many of them revered the Maccabees and that entire family. In fact, they became leaders from there to the first century. In fact, giving us what we call the Hasmonean dynasties. They go directly back to the Maccabean revolt, and so they were highly revered as something that was great in Jewish history. So the Jews of the first century would have accepted that, but I personally don't. But so that's the idea of the very well. Who was this particular man? What do we know about him? We don't have a name, but that kind of fits with John's whole MO, doesn't it? We don't have the woman at the well is not named, the nobleman is not named, the blind man in chapter 9 is not named. It's not unusual for us not to know his name, but we do know some things about him, right? For example, we know how long he was infirmed. How long was he sick? 38 years, which, by the way, was about the life expectancy of most Jews in the first century. So he has been sick for a long time. Now, how much older than 38 is he? I don't know. In John 9, the man that was born blind, it specifically tells us he was born blind. So I would think if this man was born lame, we would probably have that indication that he was born that way. So it appears that it's something that has happened to him. When Jesus comes to him and tells him, see, you are well, sin no more, Jesus seems to indicate that his infirmity, his suffering, is a result of sin, which means it's something that he did and came upon him later. We'll talk about that in just a little more detail in just a moment. What else do we know about him? When Jesus asked him, do you want to be well, what does he say? Well, it doesn't say that. What does he say? I have nobody. I have nobody. Think about Mark 2, where the lame man is carried by his 4 friends to see Jesus. And you see that here's one who has made relationships in his life. And they're called friends. They're companions. This is not his mom and dad and brother and sister. These are his friends. These are relationships that he's made even in his paralyzed lifestyle. He's been able to do that. This man has nobody. What does that tell you about this man? He's lonely. It appears that he probably camps out there night and day, long periods of time, hoping to make it into the pool because he's got nobody to put him in. Now, yes, but I don't think it has anything to do with his infirmity. I don't. We'll talk about that in just a minute too. Now, to what Terry said a moment ago, his statement, I have nobody to put me in the pool, I think, is hoping that Jesus will put him in. And that may be why he says that. But Jesus doesn't put him in, obviously. But I think that's probably his hope when he says, I have nobody to put me in. So he is lonely, and I think that's important. And he has hope, doesn't he? What's his hope? His hope is in the water. His faith is in the water. If I can get there, then I can be whole. Of course, the reader, we're sitting here, we're saying, wait a minute, you've got somebody. You've got the real power. Jesus is here with you. But he doesn't even notice Jesus because he's so focused on the water. And so, unusual in most circumstances, when someone is sick, infirmed, lame, or whatever, they come to Jesus and they seek his healing. Like the nobleman came to Jesus, my son is near death. Jairus said, my daughter is nearly dead. The woman with an issue of blood sneaks up behind him and touches the hem of his garment. They come to Jesus. This is one of the rare instances where Jesus goes to the one in need. Jesus goes to him. And he says to them, he says, do you want to be healed? And we're a little shocked. Why would Jesus, he's sitting at the pool of Bethesda hoping that the waters will heal him with all the other blind and lame people that are there. Of course he wants to be healed. So why does Jesus ask him, do you want to be healed? Ultimately, yes. To refocus him, to arrest his attention, because he doesn't know Jesus. Later, when they ask who it was, he says, I don't know. Jesus is gone. He doesn't know his name. He doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know the reputation of Jesus. He's just staring at the water. Because if he ever took his eyes off the water and the water stirred, he's cooked, right? For that day anyway, or week, or however long the tradition was. So he sat fixated on the surface of the water every day. And when other people are out there talking about Jesus and the things that this guy's doing, he doesn't care. He's watching the water. That's his only job. And in his mind, that's his only hope. And Jesus says, do you want to be healed? Now, with healing comes responsibility. Your new job is not going to be to stare at the water every day. You're going to have to go out and get a real job. Do you want to be healed? Are you ready for that? Do you want to be healed? You're going to lose any sympathy of the public that has shown you because you'll be a regular person. Do you want to be healed? Maybe that's why, but I really think it goes back to what Reed was saying. It's about getting his attention to refocus, to take his mind off of the water for just a moment. And I can almost see this conversation, Jesus standing here talking to him, and the man is answering, looking at the water. Well, I want to get healed, but I have nobody to put me into the water. And every time the water is stirred and I get up to go, someone gets in before I do. He's still not taking his eyes off the water. This is his hope. So the question is really to arrest his attention. But it reveals his faith, right? My faith is in the water. And it reveals, I think, his loneliness. I have nobody. And here's the one that can change all of that. And he doesn't even see him. And I think John purposefully plays this story this way to draw that tension, to get the reader to start rooting. Take your eyes off the water and look at Jesus. Here is the hope. And yet he doesn't do it. So Jesus heals him. Notice, Jesus said to him, get up, take up your bed and walk. And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and he walked. Now, it's interesting because Jesus gives 3 commands, right? He says, get up, then take up, and walk. For someone who has been lame for 38 years, imagine that statement. Walk. Carry my bed. I haven't done that for 38 years. Maybe he felt a tingling in his legs. I don't know. But he does what Jesus says. I mean, after all, he's distracted me from watching the water. Might as well try. Mark? I don't know if I can explain your thoughts, but I'll try. Well, Jesus, in John chapter 8, Jesus will say something very similar. He says, why do you not hear my words? The heart of faith, believing in something greater than ourselves, a truth that the nature is proclaiming to us, Psalm 19, Romans 8:20, or 1 and verse 20. There's enough here that should turn our hearts and our minds to at least a being greater than humanity. And yet, a lot of people choose not to believe. Now, they'll say, I looked at the evidence and I can't believe. And how can you believe in a God that allows all this wicked, evil things to happen? And so they're choosing not. And so they, with veiled faces, they're choosing this stupor, this ignorance, because the alternative brings them face to face with a God that they have offended by their sins. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Read.
Maybe there's something to be learned about our prayers in that example, in that we so often pray for process instead of objective. And if we would pray more for objective and let God worry about the process, we might be better off.
Yes. When I first obeyed the gospel, and I think I may have mentioned this before, I was a young Christian, and I had a hard time with prayer because, I was taught, and rightfully so, miracles have ceased. And so I didn't see how this cancer patient was going to get well without a miracle. So I didn't pray for it. Unless I could get into the process. Father, guide the hands of the surgeon as he removes the tumor. That's the process. God heal this man or this woman of cancer. That's the objective. And I think sometimes you're right. We do get caught up in the process. Now, I don't. There's nothing wrong with praying that the surgeon's hands move with experience and wisdom and understanding. But there are things that happen in this world. I don't think they're miracles, but I can't explain them. And that's God working in His providence. Just because I can't explain the process doesn't mean I don't believe that it can happen. Terry?
I pray when I hear about cancer, I pray for the discovery of a cure. Is that like a praying for a miracle?
No. No, I think a cure will eventually be found. But even if it's not, praying for it, there's nothing wrong with that. This man wanted to be healed. There's no doubt about that. He didn't notice Jesus when he came. Jesus tells him the 3 commands: get up, take up, and walk. And he responds, and it says that he was healed. Now, what's interesting is in the original language, this is what we call the aorist tense, which means it's an action that's done. In other words, this is not an ongoing healing process. When he was healed, it's done. There's only one time, really, that we see healing take place in a 2-stage process, and that's in Mark chapter 8. But all the others are immediate, and this is immediate. It's done. It's complete. There's no need for more healing after this, and so that's in the area. And then it says in verse 9 also that he took up his bed. He picked up his bed, which would have been like a straw mat that was tied together with twine or yarn in order to be basic. It's basically just a mat to lay on, and he took it up. Again, that verb is in the aorist tense. It's done. He's completed. And then it says, and he walked. It's not in the aorist. It's in the imperfect. And it means that he just kept walking and kept walking and kept walking, which, if our theory at the beginning that a psychosomatic response of exuberance, of coming out of the water after being the first one, gave someone a jolt of energy that they felt good and they went leaping, only to find themselves hours later in the same condition they were in before. This man is testing it out. He's testing his healing. I don't know who this joker is that told me to get up, but I did it. I'm walking. This is great. but I'm going to keep on walking. And so it's in the imperfect tense. It's something that is ongoing. And then, of course, Jesus then, it says, John tells us at the end of verse 9, now that was the Sabbath. Hold on a minute. Stop the presses. Up until this point, this is just your everyday run-of-the-mill Jesus healing session, right? But John holds this fact until the end. Now, the other places where it's a Sabbath healing, it would say, on the Sabbath, Jesus met the man that was lame. And it would tell you at the beginning, but John doesn't tell us at the beginning. He waits until the healing is done and says, and by the way, it was a Sabbath. And it's meant to be a shocker because people aren't expecting that. This is a Sabbath day healing. And what happens is it ignites a firestorm among the Jews and the Jewish leaders. Notice verse 10. So the Jews said to the man, this is the first time the Jews are introduced into the context. These Jews or Jewish leaders, they said to the man who had been healed, it is the Sabbath and it's not lawful for you to take up your bed. You cannot carry your bed. And of course, they're looking at passages like Exodus 31, verses 12 through 17, where God said to Moses, you are to speak to the people of Israel and say, above all you shall keep my Sabbath. For this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you. You shall keep the Sabbath because it is holy for you. And everyone who profanes it shall be put to death. Whoever does any work on it, that soul shall be cut off from among the people. 6 days shall work be done, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath, a solemn rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does work on the Sabbath day shall be put to death. Therefore the people of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout their generations as a covenant. No work on the Sabbath. In Jeremiah, it talks about do not carry a burden out of your house on the Sabbath day. Jeremiah 17, 21 through 27. Nehemiah, chapter 13 says the same thing. And so the question would be, what's work or what's a burden? And the Jews spent generation after generation after generation trying to define what is work and what is a burden. And they wrote a lot of literature trying to explain those things. And among the body of work is what we call the Mishnahs. And in Mishnah Shabbat, which is one of the writings of rabbinic traditions, it says specifically that you cannot carry your bed. It's the same bed that's used here. Can't carry it on the Sabbath day because that you would be liable of the law. That's Shabbat 7. Hold on just a second. I'm going to run out of time if I stop. That's Shabbat 7 in verse 2. Later in Shabbat 10 and verse 5, get this, the irony of the twist. You cannot carry your bed, but if someone is in the bed, you can carry the bed with the person in it. But that's how convoluted the traditions had become and built up around the law. And they said to this man, you can't do that. And he said, the man who healed me, that man said to me, it's not my fault. The man who healed me told me to do it. Oh yeah, who was this man that healed you? That's not what they say, is it? Who is this man that commanded you to take up your bed? They don't care about the healing. They don't care about the person. It's about the law. It's about our traditions. Jesus does not command this man to break the law. He commands this man. In effect, he challenges the traditions of the law and ultimately ties himself to God. Look at verse 17 and 18. But Jesus answered them, my Father is working until now, and I am working. This was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. John sets this up as the tension about the Sabbath. It's not just about the following the Sabbath, but it's about Jesus' identity. He's making himself equal with God. They understood that. We understand that when we read it today. And Jesus tells him, notice, go and sin no more. Now, Jesus does not buy into the prevailing theory that sin is a result, or suffering is a result of some sin in your life. You know, the poor counselors of Job, that's what they thought. And a lot of people understood that. In fact, when you get into John 9 and the blind man, the first question the disciples have, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he should be born blind? Jesus knows that suffering is not always a result of sin. But he also knows that some suffering is a result of sin. We even have it today. There are diseases that have entered the human race because of sin. And people who contract those diseases, contract them and suffer from them through sin. Just a known fact. Doesn't mean that everyone who is suffering had sinned, or that it's a result of their sin, but there are some who are suffering as a direct result of sin. And Jesus tells this man, sin no more. Sin got you into this, sin will get you right back into it. And people love to be told they're sinners and their fate is a result of sin and told to sin no more. They love that, right? No. First thing he does, he says, I'll show you. He goes back to the Jews and he says, the man you're looking for, his name's Jesus, and he's right over there. What's amazing about this whole context is Jesus openly heals this man, shows compassion to him. Even though he didn't know Jesus, he didn't believe in Jesus, faith was not created in his heart. This is a man who has thrown Jesus under the bus and walks away. Why do you think he had no friends? Yeah. He was very selfish. He was in trouble with the Jews. He's told that he's a sinner. And then he goes and he tells the Jews to get them off his back. It was Jesus to get him off his back, and he goes on about his life. Sometimes we want to condition our compassion for others on their belief, on their willingness to study the Bible with us or attend services with us. We cannot condition our compassion to those in need on whether or not they will ever believe. Jesus didn't. And we have no business doing that either. All right, that's about what I've got. Appreciate your attention tonight. Next week we're going to be looking at John 9. Yes, Carolyn.